I remember the night I finally admitted to myself that nobody was coming to save me, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was honest, and that honesty hurt worse than any rejection I'd ever had. It was 3:30 in the morning, February 2004. I woke up on 9th Avenue that smelled like burnt coffee and wet dog. I was 34 years old, still waiting for the phone to ring with the part that would prove I belonged here, still telling myself that if I just stayed angry enough, hungry enough, the world would finally have to look at me and see something undeniable. I'd come home from another audition where the casting director had smiled, that thin, polite smile, and said, "We're going in a different direction," which is the industry's kind way of saying, "You're not what we pictured when we pictured a man." I threw my sides in the trash, missed, left them scattered on the floor like dead birds. I opened the fridge, stared at nothing, closed it. I turned on the television, turned it off. I paced the 6 steps from the kitchenette to the window and back, counting them like rosary beads. And then, without warning, something inside me simply stopped pretending. I sat down on the floor, right there between the radiator that clanked like a dying animal and the futon that had never quite unfolded properly. And I started to shake. Not crying yet, just shaking, the way you do when the cold finally gets through every layer you thought was keeping you safe. And in that shaking, I heard a voice, mine, but older, warier, saying out loud for the first time, "You're tired, Peter. You're so fucking tired and nobody's coming." That was it. No thunderclap. No cinematic collapse, just the quiet, brutal recognition that I had spent 15 years building a life around the hope that someday someone would see past the body I was born into and hand me the keys to worthiness, and that day was never going to come, because worthiness was never theirs to give. I had been standing outside my own door, knocking, waiting for permission to come home to myself, and the joke was there was nobody inside but me, and I had locked myself out. I don't know how long I sat there, lost its edges. At some point, the shaking turned into sobbing, the kind that starts in your gut and rips its way out like it's trying to turn you inside out. I cried for the little boy who used to stand on a chair in the living room reciting Shakespeare to his parents' friends because it made the room go quiet in a way that felt like love. I cried for the teenager who learned to make jokes about his height before anyone else could, who turned cruelty into armor and then mistook the armor for skin. I cried for every audition where I walked in smiling like a man who didn't care every night. I drank too much because tomorrow might be the day. Every morning I woke up still waiting. I cried because I was exhausted from performing Invincibility and because the performance had worked. Nobody knew how hollow I was, not even the people who loved me, maybe especially not them. And in that emptiness, in that stripped bare moment, I understood something that felt like dying and being born. In the same breath, the life I had been living was a dress rehearsal for a play nobody had hired me to be in. I didn't sleep that night. When the sky over the air shaft turned the color of dishwater, I got up, knees creaking, and I did the only thing that made sense. I started cleaning, not metaphorically, literally. I gathered every rejection letter I'd saved like battle scars, every headshot with the forced smile, every script. I'd annotated like scripture, and I carried them down 4 flights of stairs to the dumpster in the alley. The cold bit my face, but it felt clean. I came back up and opened the window even though it was February, let the air scrape the staleness out of the room. Then I sat down at the little fold-out table I used as a desk, and I wrote one line on a blank page, "What?" If I stopped waiting, that was all. I stared at it until the letters blurred, and then I wrote another. What? If the life I want starts the moment I decide I'm already enough. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt like the first honest thing I'd said to myself in years. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet and terrifying. I stopped going to auditions that asked me to play leprechauns or elves or comic relief with a wink. I turned down a commercial for a fantasy film because the director wanted me to ride a giant toad and say, "Ribbit, me lord," with a twinkle in my eye. My agent at the time called me difficult. I told him I was finally becoming easy with the truth. He dropped me 3 days later. I didn't fight it. I got a job teaching acting at a community center in Washington Heights. Kids who came after school with dreams bigger than their circumstances. I taught them voice and movement and how to walk into a room like you. Already belonged there because I was finally learning it myself. On Thursdays, I poured pints at a pub in Hell's Kitchen where the regulars didn't care who you were trying to become. They just wanted another round and a story. I started writing again, not the angry monologues I used to think were profound, but small, true things. Scenes about fathers and sons, about loneliness that wears a smile, about the moment a man realizes the mountain he's been climbing is made of his own fear. There's a moment in The Little Prince where the fox says, one sees clearly only with the heart. Anything essential is invisible to the eyes. I'd read it 100 times and thought it was pretty. After that night on the floor, I understood it was surgery. Everything I had been chasing, recognition, applause, the perfect role, was visible. And none of it could see me. The essential thing was the part of me I had kept hidden even from myself, the scared kid who just wanted to be loved for exactly who he was, no more, no less. I started looking with my heart instead of my resume. I started listening for the sound of my own yes instead of waiting for someone else's. I wish I could tell you there was a neat moment when everything clicked. A callback. That changed everything. A script that arrived like a burning bush. There wasn't. There was just the slow, stubborn accumulation of days where I chose truth over performance. I called my mother more. I let her hear the tiredness in my voice instead of the bravado. I went home for Thanksgiving and sat on the porch with my dad and didn't fill the silence with jokes. I started saying no to the things that made me smaller and yes to the things that asked me to take up the space I'd always been afraid to occupy. I read Rilke's letters to a young poet like it was written directly to me, especially the part where he says, you have to love your solitude and the storm that it brings. I learned to sit in my apartment without turning on the television just to have noise. I learned the sound of my own breathing when it wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. One spring morning, maybe a year after the night on the floor, I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my voicemail for callbacks in weeks. Not because I'd given up, because I simply didn't need them to tell me who I was anymore. I opened the window and the city smelled like coffee and possibility instead of exhaust and desperation. I made tea in a clean mug. I sat down and wrote 10 pages of a screenplay about a man who spends his whole life trying to prove he's more than his body, only to discover the body was never the problem. The fear was. I called it the station agent because sometimes the place you end up when you stop running is exactly where you were meant to begin. Years later, when people ask me about breakthroughs, about the role that changed everything, I think of that night on the floor. I think of the moment I stopped waiting for the world to hand me my worth and started building it. Myself, brick by ugly brick. Tyrion Lannister came later. The awards, the magazine covers, the surreal moment of standing on a stage holding something heavy and gold while millions of people clapped. All of that came later. But the man who could carry those moments without disappearing inside them was born in a 5th floor walk-up on 9th Avenue, crying between a broken futon and a radiator that wouldn't shut up. Finally telling himself the truth. That's the part I want you to hear, really hear. The turning point was never the yes. It was the night I survived the no, all the no's, the ones from casting directors, and the ones I kept giving myself. It was the night I decided that being unseen by the world didn't mean I had to keep hiding from myself. I'm not telling you this because my story is special. I'm telling you because it's ordinary. Because every one of us has a night, or a morning, or a moment in traffic when the armor finally cracks and the truth slips in like light under a door. And in that moment you get to decide, do I keep performing or do I start living? I still have hard days. Days when an old voice whispers that maybe they were right, maybe I don't belong, maybe I've just been lucky. On those days I go back to the floor in my mind. I feel the cold linoleum under my legs. I hear the radiator clanking its useless song, and I remember that the moment I thought would destroy me was the moment I finally came home to myself. Scarred, imperfect, small in stature, but no longer small in spirit. The man who walked out of that apartment the next morning wasn't fixed. He was free. Free to be afraid and still keep going. Free to love without auditioning for it. Free to take up space. Not because the world had finally given permission, but because I had stopped asking. If you're waiting, stop. If you're hiding, open the door. If you're shaking on the floor somewhere, convinced this is the end, listen, this is the beginning. The essential things are still there, waiting under all the noise you've been using to drown them out. Your worth was never up for audition. Was always already yours. The only person who can cast you as the lead in your own life is you. And the beautiful, terrifying, sacred truth is that you don't have to be unbroken to start. You just have to be honest. That night taught me honesty is the door. Courage is walking through it. And love, real love, the kind that doesn't leave when the reviews are bad, starts with the person in the mirror finally looking back without flinching. I still flinch sometimes, but less, and when I don't, when I stand in my kitchen and the morning light hits the scars just right, and I feel for one clear moment entirely at home in my own skin, I know that every tear I cried on that floor was a seed. And the man I am now, the life I get to live now, is what grew when I finally stopped running and let the truth have its way with me. You can too. You are already enough. The only question left is whether you're ready to believe it. I truly hope that tonight is the night you do.